call a disputed Pauline letter. There are 13 letters of Paul, 7 of which are undisputed. These are letters that all modern scholars, for the most part, agree Paul wrote. Then there are these 6 disputed letters, and typically Ephesians and Colossians are kind of kept in one camp. 2 Thessalonians is there kind of on it in a different camp, and then you have what we call the pastoral epistles, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus in another bucket. But these are the 6 that make up the disputed letters. And we could do an episode on that at some point if there's interest, but what I'm just going to focus on here is Ephesians. So why do some scholars have a hard time believing Paul wrote Ephesians? There's 3 main reasons why. The first is the style of the letter. The idea here is that the Greek style, the style of the Greek writing in Ephesians and Colossians are very similar. I'll talk about them more in a moment. Seem different than the style of the Greek in some of the other Pauline letters. Now, this, of course, presumes that the 7 authentic letters, which are kind of diverse in and of themselves, but let's say the 7 authentic letters actually could allow us to establish a Pauline style. We could then compare the style of Ephesians to those and say, it looks like a different hand. In fact, that is not very scientific. We don't have enough data, frankly, to really know what Paul's Greek writing looked like, whether it was consistent or changed in style depending on the circumstances. We're dealing with letters that have been written also by secretaries. So it's a very tricky issue to kind of isolate a scholar's writing style from antiquity, in particular with the amount of data we're working with Paul. And I think most critical scholars would acknowledge the difficulty there. I think the one that becomes more compelling for some scholars is the theology of Ephesians. And I'll keep this really simple. I think it comes down to, for many scholars, that there's a picture that emerges of Paul, let's say the historical Paul versus the canonical Paul, the Paul we have in Scripture. The historical Paul is a construct that comes out of that Paul, that we think what actually Paul did and looked like and thought, maybe not look like, we don't know too much about that, but what he thought. So many scholars work with the idea that Paul had an imminent expectation of the parousia of Jesus. That is the return of Jesus Christ. Paul was running around the ancient Mediterranean world trying to convert as many people as he could to Jesus Messiah before Jesus' return to judge the nations. And so that's Paul's focus. He's laser focused on the return of Jesus. And when we look to Ephesians, the return of Jesus seems to have, it hasn't gone away. I think that's really important to emphasize, but it seems to be less emphasized. Paul seems more interested, or the writer of Ephesians seems more interested in the session of Jesus Christ at the right hand of God. So that's one reason, and I'll make some comments on why I think that's problematic. The other one that kind of fits with that is the portrait of the church or the people of God. The ecclesia is just a word for assembly. So when Paul addresses ecclesiae in various parts of the ancient world, he's talking about local communities, right? The ecclesia or ecclesiae in Corinth, right? Groups of assemblies. When we look at Ephesians, that term seems to be used in a more global sense. We're moving towards something like the Catholic Church, if you will, a universal church. So scholars see, that is to say, development from the theology of the authentic or say undisputed Pauline letters. They see a development from that to the theology they see in Ephesians and in Colossians. I have to say, I don't find this particularly persuasive. I do agree that Paul was expecting the return of Jesus in his lifetime. It's something that he had on his radar. But I also think he left his community with a theology and a way of doing life that allowed that to persist beyond one generation. And I think the church has always been doing that, adjusting and so forth. So I don't see the sort of neurosis or major communal crisis caused by the delay of the parousia that some modern scholars speculate about. I mean, you see some evidence, for example, in 2 Peter, people talking about the day of the Lord not coming, but I just don't see it there. And especially in the patristic sources, early patristic sources, they really don't seem to be treating it as a problem that Jesus hasn't returned yet, even though the texts do lay out that expectation. So I don't think that we see kind of that. The other thing, too, I'll say is, Ephesians is definitely focused on the return of Jesus still. It's just that the focus is particularly on Jesus at the right hand of God. But that is a focus we see in other Pauline letters as well. So I don't see that as a deviation. It might be one receives more focus in some letters than another, but I don't see the kind of huge cosmic leap that some want to assert between the Undisputeds and Ephesians on this point. So I don't find that particularly compelling. The last point, the connection to Colossians. Of course, Colossians is also a disputed epistle. And so if you don't think Paul wrote Colossians, then you're probably not going to think he wrote Ephesians, because Ephesians is clearly dependent in some way on Colossians. It's not a slavish dependency. There's a lot of overlap in phrases and theology. The only place where you find a lot of direct overlap is at the end of the letter. The final closing greeting is 49 words in the Greek. It's been taken over and copied basically in Ephesians. Other than that, you can do kind of parallels of the two, and you can see all the overlap in thought and terminology. Clearly, these two letters have been written together. But if we believe Paul wrote Colossians, it's not a problem, I don't think, to come up with a scenario or a set of plausible scenarios where he could have written Colossians and Ephesians at the same time, or used Colossians again in the writing of Ephesians at that time. So I don't find that particularly compelling. I do want to touch on one more point, and I'm trying to try not to belabor this too much because I want to get into the parts about why I really love Ephesians. But I want to mention the issue of pseudepigraphy more broadly, because it is something that's gotten out there in the larger popular discourse. People are now more aware, I think, that modern scholars don't believe in many cases that some of the books that are ascribed to New Testament authors, like letters, have been written by them. And so I'll just talk about this in terms of, again, Ephesians. Keep it there for today. So this idea of pseudepigraphy, writing in the name of another author. One popular example of this is Bart Ehrman, who's a scholar I deeply respect. He's not really nice, great guy as far as I can tell, and have seen him in person at conferences. He's a well-respected text critic, and he also writes popularly about the New Testament and other issues surrounding Christian origins. He wrote a book called Forgeries, which was, kind of implying that a lot of the New Testament is based on this deceptive practice of writing in the name of another author. And here's where I just want to kind of caution us a little bit as modern readers of the Bible, that ancients didn't think about authorship the way that we necessarily did. So they absolutely had a category for forgery, and Paul even mentions, or if you don't think he wrote Thessalonians, there is mention of the people writing in our name, the potential for forgery out there. So, and the early church was aware of this as well, of the possibility of this kind of forgery. But there are other models of flexibility in authorship, kinds of pseudepigraphy that wouldn't be deemed problematic or forgery in that way. So I just want to give you two quick examples. And our examples are limited. They come from people like, I'm going to talk about Cicero here, elite Greco-Roman authors who had large letter collections and talk about in their letters, their writings, their practices of writing. That's kind of what we're limited to as historians from such a distance. But Cicero, for example, gives an example of authorship as he authorizing his scribe Atticus to write on his behalf. In other words, he gave Atticus, his scribe, whom he trusted, we assume, permission to write a letter on his behalf, or write letters. This is what Cicero says to Atticus. If there are any people to whom you think that letters ought to be delivered in my name, pray, compose them and see them delivered, right? So this is a way of Cicero authorizing the use of his name, his authorial authority, if you will, or persona. He's authorizing Atticus to use that as an extension of his authorship. And that actually kind of fits the model that some scholars, at least, if you don't think Ephesians was written during Paul's lifetime, well, it's clearly Pauline in outlook, and if it's some kind of development, it's likely this kind of a development where Paul has authorized the use of his thinking, his name, maybe even some of his writing to put this letter together. So it's a possibility, right? I'm not suggesting that it has to be this way, but I'm just highlighting that there are different ways of thinking about this, right? There's also the example of authorship as if, one writing as if they are the other person. Again, this one might be moving closer to forgery, but there's still examples where it's not deemed problematic or forgery in quite that way. Cicero, for example, has a different secretary write in the name of Atticus, and he dictates the letter, and this is praised by a certain Callias, that Atticus is praised for this. And this is a way of Cicero increasing the profile of Atticus, and even though he didn't have Atticus's permission necessarily to do this. So there are other examples of writing, and I just wanted to point that out so that we're aware that this is a more complex, nuanced conversation than simply either Paul wrote it or it's a lie.